Hello, Walter. Do you hear us?
Hi,
Good
can you hear me?
afternoon. You are really welcome. Eu não estou vendo reação, Bruno.
But
Daquele ask to unmute é o comando. Ask to unmute. Hã?
I'm not muted.
Okay, great, Walter.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Good. Can I share my screen?
Please.
I'm disabled from sharing.
Bruno, dá o status de share the screen pro Walter. Yes, they are fixing that.
I'm so sorry that I can't be there to have feijoada for lunch.
Yeah, Peter had like three or four dishes of feijoada to maybe compensate for you.
Okay.
Hey, you guys can talk with Walter with the mic, no problem.
Yeah, I was eating feijoada for you, Walter. It was wonderful. I was thinking of you every bite. And last night we went to an all-you-can-eat barbecue, and we almost exploded from eating so much meat. It was amazing.
How's that? Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see everything. And
Good.
you.
So, I mean, this is a man that needs no introduction, but even though I want to introduce you to our next keynote speaker, Professor Walter Sinnott-Armstrong. This is unfortunately our last online talk, and Adina is wrapping up the whole thing. But I mean, it's what is it striking about Walter is how prolific he is as an author. Books as Pyrrhonian Skepticism, Moral Skepticism, Moral Psychology Volume 1, Moral Psychology Volume 2, Moral Psychology Volume 3, Moral Psychology Volume 4, Morality Without God, Finding Consciousness, Think Again. I mean, so many books. I mean, it's impressive the amount of intellectual work Walter presented us with. And I mean, as everybody knows, one of the most sincere intellectuals we have among our community. And also, a man that is never satisfied. He's always looking for new stuff to research. So without further ado, a big round of applause for Mr. Walter Sinnott-Armstrong.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for having me and for organizing this. I also want to thank all the translators who are doing a tremendous job, and all of the speakers before me. I've learned an awful lot from the talks that I've been able to attend. And I apologize for not being able to attend in person, but it just didn't work out because of the pandemic and other things. But I do hope to get down to Brazil again very soon to have some feijoada with all of you. Last time in June, when this group met, I talked about free will. Today, I'm going to talk instead about consciousness and responsibility and the role of consciousness in ascriptions of responsibility. So this really is different work. It's done with tremendous help from Claire Simmons and Christina Krasic, who is here in the audience. She's here to take all of your technical questions in case I don't know what I'm talking about. She'll help us out. There's been a recent debate about consciousness and responsibility. So some people, including, for example, George Scher, claim that you can be responsible without awareness. That's the subtitle of his book. He argues that in particular, you can be responsible when you're unaware if your lack of awareness falls below some applicable standard, which kind of means, in short, you're negligent, right? You should have done better. And also a second condition, that your lack of awareness is caused by your attitudes, dispositions, and traits. Some would say your deep self. He's not alone. Angela Smith talks about forgetting. There are other people on that side that argue you can be responsible without consciousness. But Neil Levy responds in a 2014 book, arguing for what he calls the consciousness thesis, which says consciousness of some of the facts that give our actions their moral significance is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. You could also cite Rosen and Zimmerman and others as arguing for similar claims. Okay. Now notice that both Schur and Levy agree that occurrent consciousness is necessary for moral responsibility when those two conditions are not met. Okay. When you're not negligent and it's not caused by your deep self, then it's necessary. And occurrent consciousness is necessary. You have to actually be conscious, not just able to become conscious. You have to actually be conscious. I'm going to deny that claim. I'm going to say sometimes you're responsible without being actually conscious in the moment of relevant facts. You're gonna be responsible in the moment without, even if you don't, it's not that you need the ability, you need the occurrent consciousness according to them. I'm going to claim that you don't need a current consciousness even when those conditions are not met. Sorry about that confusing way of putting that. Okay, so we got to get clear about what the different words are to understand this debate. What is responsibility? Well, the notion of responsibility is used in a lot of different ways. I'm not going to try to explain all of these. We're not talking about causal responsibility, such as when the drought is responsible for the famine. We're not talking about role responsibility, such as when parents are responsible for their children. We're talking about liability to certain types of sanctions. And we're not going to be talking about the law or legal responsibility, although I'll mention some legal cases. Our focus is going to be on liability to moral sanctions, such as emotions like anger, public condemnation, speech acts of various sorts, maybe not inviting someone to your party because you think that they're a bad person, that type of social sanction as opposed to official legal sanctions. So we're talking about moral liability. Within that heading, there are two kinds of responsibility or moral liability. You might be liable to being criticized as a bad person if your act shows that you have a bad character trait. But we're going to be talking about when the act is enough to justify imposing some kind of sanction on you. Accountability. You're accountable for what you did and the damage that you caused. Now, the punishment might not be an official punishment in the law, but as I said, it might be public criticism or ostracism. And in the positive case, it might be a reward, or it might just be emotions. There's a lot of different types of sanctions, but what we're going to be interested in is moral accountability. And furthermore, direct moral accountability. I'm not going to be talking about cases where somebody is responsible now for something they did a long time ago in the past. So our topic is direct moral accountability. That's what I mean by responsibility from here on. What about consciousness? Well, there are lots of theories of consciousness. There's the higher order theory, recurrent processing theory, global workspace theory, information integration theory. You know, I could give a whole hour-long talk about these different theories, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to tell you from the start, for those who are familiar with these debates, that I actually think those different theories are a bit about different kinds of consciousness. The higher order theory and recurrent processing theory are primarily about phenomenal consciousness, or what it is like to experience a certain kind of property. The global workspace theory is primarily about access consciousness, what kinds of things you're aware of and how you use the information that you're aware of in your decisions and reasoning. And the information integration theory is primarily about creature consciousness and wakefulness. So the different theories, it's not clear to me they really disagree with each other. They're just about different topics. We are going to focus on access consciousness and the global workspace theory. Because again, Levy does. Here's a quotation from Levy. Contents that might plausibly ground responsibility, that is, objects of consciousness, things that you are conscious of that might make you responsible, are personally available for report under report conducive conditions and for the driving of further behavior. Okay, so they have to be available to you as a person for report. We ask you, are you aware of that? And you're able to report it, at least under conditions that are conducive to reporting. But in addition to reports, they also have to be available for driving of further behavior, including reasoning, choices, and other things besides report. Okay, and the last line is important too. It's not just that these items and this information has to be personally available. You have to actually make yourself, give yourself access to it. It has to be occurrent, not just available, but occurrent in actually shaping your behavior or cognition. So the idea is that the consciousness we're talking about is when you're able to report, it affects your behavior, and it's occurrent, not just potential or possible for you. Okay. Now, although I'm going to focus on access consciousness, I want to start with a few words about creature consciousness. Humans have what's often called creature consciousness. Jellyfish do not have creature consciousness. One indication of that is they have no brains, okay? But notice that snakes and dogs do have creature consciousness. For example, they can feel pain, but they're not morally responsible. So mere creature consciousness is not sufficient for moral responsibility, maybe because intelligence at a certain level is also necessary. But creature consciousness still might be necessary for moral responsibility. And Levy claims so on page 111, which is why I'm mentioning it here. This requirement might explain why jellyfish are not morally responsible, because they don't have creature consciousness. But notice that the reason why jellyfish lack moral responsibility might instead not be because they lack creature consciousness, but only because they lack intelligence. So you can't use these kinds of examples to argue for the claim that creature consciousness is necessary for moral responsibility. Still might be. I'm not going to take a stand on that issue. I'm mentioning these two first kinds of consciousness mainly to distinguish them from what I'm going to focus on. Wakefulness. Organisms with creature consciousness can lack another kind of consciousness, wakefulness, which is a temporary state that's absent when you're asleep and not dreaming, if you have a seizure, if you're in a fugue state of some sort, or if you're under anesthesia, okay? You can still be said to have creature consciousness in some sense, but you're not awake. And notice that a sleeping partner in bed with you is not morally responsible for stealing the blanket that you're both sharing. And that's true even if your partner is dreaming. So it might seem that wakefulness is necessary for responsibility. But there's a problem here too. They might lack moral responsibility because they lack intentionality. After all, your partner didn't intentionally take the blanket away from you. And that might explain why they lack moral responsibility instead of that being explained because they lack wakefulness. If so, then you would expect a sleeping agent to be responsible for acts that are intentional, okay? If there are any, but how could you have an intentional act when you're asleep? Well, the answer is sleepwalking. And Levy actually discusses this classic case of Regina versus Parks. Kenneth Parks arose from his bed, drove 14 miles to the house of his in-laws, and he was supposed to be close to his in-laws, and strangled his father-in-law, then bludgeoned his mother-in-law. Parks then arrived at the police station on his own, under his own power. And police said he seemed confused about what had happened or transpired, and that he appeared oblivious to the fact that he had severed tendons in both of his hands during the attack. Now, that obliviousness to pain, along with many other things, such as a family history of parasomnias, including sleepwalking, led the experts to testify at the trial that Parks had been sleepwalking during the attack. And on that basis, the court found Parks not guilty. So they did not see him as criminally or legally responsible. Okay, what about moral responsibility? Well, I want to agree with Levy. I don't think Parks was morally responsible. Why not? Well, he was not responsive to reasons. His behaviors were inflexible and didn't respond to reasons such as the fact that he liked his in-laws. And so his acts did not express his deep self, because he did care for his in-laws. Okay, so that makes sense that he's not responsible. But I want to contrast this case with another case, which is also a real case. An epileptic was found legally responsible when he failed to take his medication, drove a car with several kids in the car, had a seizure while he was driving, lost consciousness, and caused an accident that killed 4 people. Now, in that case, he was found responsible. So what's the difference between the Parks case and the epileptic case? Well, it seems that the epileptic didn't take reasonable precautions. They knew they were an epileptic. They had prescribed medication that they knew they were supposed to be taking, and they didn't take it. Whereas Parks had no way of knowing that he was going to do anything like what he did. So it seems to me humans can be responsible while they're unconscious if they're conscious of a risk of losing consciousness and fail to take reasonable precautions against causing harm when they do become unconscious. But this responsibility is indirect because it transfers from their prior consciousness. So the driver was conscious when they got into the car and started driving that there was a risk. That's what makes them responsible for the later act, even though they were not conscious at the time. So responsibility still might require either wakefulness or negligence, that disjunction that Schur would claim in his theory that I mentioned at the start. Okay, so much for creature consciousness and wakefulness. I'd be interested if you have any comments or questions about it, but my real focus, and I mention it partly because Levy and others discuss these kinds of cases as well, but I want to contrast that with what's going to be the main topic here, the content of consciousness. So when we humans are awake, humans, so we have creature consciousness, we're awake and we choose actions, we are conscious of or aware of some but not other relevant facts, okay? But our actions are still influenced by other factors that we're not conscious of. Notice that I say aware, sometimes say aware of when it's consciousness of a certain fact. Sometimes Levy uses the word aware of. I'm going to use those interchangeably when we're talking about the content of consciousness. But the main point here is that we're not conscious of lots of factors that influence our actions and choices. And this unconscious influence might seem to undermine or reduce responsibility. at least according to Levy and his consciousness thesis. And he's not alone there. Other people agree. So Caruso, for example, believes that the pervasiveness of non-conscious processes rules out moral responsibility. Okay, that's a strong view. A little bit weaker view, more restricted view, is Eddie Namias, who says the moral psychology and social psychology research offers evidence of cases where we don't know why we do what we do, and where we make up reasons for why we did what we did. By the way, making them up without knowing that we're saying anything false, but we're still constructing it. And Namias says, this research is suggesting that we have less free will than we tend to think we have. Not like Caruso, he's not saying we have no free will or responsibility. He's saying we have less free will and responsibility. They do talk about free will as well as responsibility, although those quotations are on different topics somewhat. Okay, so does it really undermine responsibility in that way? Well, we got to get clear about what you're conscious or not conscious of, okay? When somebody acts, they might or they might not have consciousness that they're making a decision, okay? That's what's at stake, for example, in the Libet studies that other speakers have discussed, okay? They might or might not have consciousness of the kind of act that they're choosing, right? For example, is it stealing? If you're not conscious that this thing belongs to someone else, then you might not be conscious that you are performing an act that is a kind of stealing. They might or might not be conscious of the effects of the act. For example, this is going to kill somebody. You know, if you give them poison instead of sugar in their coffee. They might or might not be conscious of a factor that influences their decision. And of course, they might be conscious of that factor, but not aware that it influences their decision. That's a different matter. Consciousness that the factor influences the decision is different from consciousness of that factor itself. Okay? Now, what we're going to do here is focus on the last two, consciousness of an influence or of a factor that influences the decision. I wanted to bring the others up to make it clear what I'm focusing on here. Okay. Now, there are lots of different experiments that show unconscious influences. Liad Mudrik and others, including Adina Roskis, who might be in the audience now, I'm not sure because she's going next. We analyzed over 60 studies where agents were aware of certain information, were not aware that that information was influencing their decision, and believed that the information should not influence their decision. Okay. Now, many of these studies have been criticized. I'm not endorsing them. I'm trying to give you a flavor for the kind of research that many, many people have done. Okay. In some cases, it's information about the context that unconsciously influences the decision. So an example might be nudging. If you have a default of donating your organs, so you have to check a box if you're not going to be an organ donor, then more people will donate than if you have a default of not donating your organs, and you have to check a box if you do become an organ donor. Okay. Now, people are aware that they're being, that of what the default is. They know what they're doing, and so, and yet it influences their action. They might not know that the default is influencing them at that point. Framing, people are more opposed to something that's described as letting die than they are when it's described as not saving. Okay. Anchoring, people are willing to pay a higher price um, when the item is compared to a more expensive option than they are when it's compared to a less expensive option. Okay. Placement, people tend to prefer a product that's located in the middle of a display instead of at the ends of the display, according to some studies. Exposure, people tend to prefer items that they've seen before instead of items that they haven't seen before, even if there's no significant difference between them. So they think, well, that shouldn't matter. Okay, so that's the context in which it's the decision is made. Also, the content or the object of consciousness can unconsciously influence the decision, or certain properties of the object of consciousness. Okay, so in stereotypes, many doctors give less pain medication to Black patients than they do to white patients. Many judges seem to give more punishment for unattractive defendants and less punishment for attractive defendants. Some great, very interesting studies there. And finally, not just the context of the decision and the content, but the object, the thing that you're conscious of, but the state of the agent. Okay, the agent might be hungry. In the famous Israeli study, judges were giving parole at a much higher rate right after a break when they had a snack than before a break when they were hungry or tired. So all of these things, there's some evidence. As I said, many of these studies are questionable, have failed to be replicated and so on, but others provide strong evidence. And the general picture seems to be clear. I know a lot of people question individual studies, but the general picture seems to be widely accepted. Okay, so what do we say about moral responsibility? Well, Levy says this kind of stuff removes responsibility, but I'm not sure about this. I don't understand why. The customer, it seems to me, is responsible for buying the item in the middle of the display. They, know that it's in the middle of the display, but they picked it out and they could have easily gone to the left or right. The organ donor deserves credit for donating organs, even if, they were nudged by a default. The doctor, seems to me, deserves blame for giving too little pain medication to a Black patient who needs more. And the judge deserves blame for giving a too harsh sentence to a defendant that's unattractive when they don't really deserve that much. Okay. Now, why? Why are they responsible? Well, they're in control. They're able to choose otherwise. They're aware of what they choose. They're aware of the factor that does influence their decision, even if they're not aware that that factor is influencing their decision. And they're aware of the main reasons for and against their choices. The doctor knows that the Black patient needs pain medication and that giving too much will be harmful. So they're aware of the main reasons for and against. Just to focus on the case of the doctor and the judge for a minute, all that they're not conscious of are comparative judgments, comparisons between the choice that they're making right now and their other choices in different cases, right? If the judge gives a harsh sentence to an unattractive defendant, they're not aware that, they gave a less harsh sentence to a similar but attractive defendant. That's comparing the two cases. But why would that lack of awareness reduce their responsibility? I think it doesn't, because the comparison between the two cases is not a reason for the sentence. And so they're not responsible for, I'm sorry. And so they are responsible for making the judgment they make because they are reacting to the reasons for and against that case, even if they're not aware of the comparison to other cases, and they're not aware that their judgment is being based on the attractiveness or unattractiveness of the defendant. or the skin color of the patient. Okay. So that was about consciousness of influence. Now, what about consciousness of morally relevant facts? And after all, this is the main thing that Levy was talking about in his consciousness thesis. Consciousness of some of the facts that give our actions their moral significance is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. Notice that some of the facts, he's not saying just one. One's not going to be enough. But you don't have to know them all either. And it's not really clear exactly how many you need to know or which ones you need to know. But at least the general picture is clearer if we think of an example. And this is a classic example from Fisher and Ravizza 20 years ago, but others like Mealy and others have repeated it. They say that a driver is not responsible when he, quote, backs his car out of his garage unaware that a tiny kitten is snoozing beneath the rear tire. And if he backs up, he's going to kill the kitten. Is he responsible for killing the kitten? Okay. And they say, no. But why not? Right? Because he's not conscious of it. But why is consciousness necessary for responsibility? It might be that the driver doesn't possess the information. But wait a minute, you can possess information without being conscious of possessing it. Oh, you can't access it? Is that it? Well, you might possess it without being able to access it, but you have to be able to access it in order to be responsible. You can't use the information in your reasoning, decision-making, speech, and so on. Is that the idea? Or the driver can't control action without consciousness. I think all of these are different, and at various points, people appeal to different ones. But Levy focuses on using the information to control the action and says you cannot use it appropriately to control action without being conscious of it. That's his view. So my response is, wait a minute. We can access information and use it to control actions without becoming conscious. One classic case, although a clinical case, is when there's brain damage to certain parts of the occipital lobe, you get cases of blind sight. And Levy discusses these. In the blind sight cases, the person has part of their visual field they're unable to see out of. And if you ask them about items in that part of the visual field, they will say, well, I don't know, I can't see it. But then they can perform actions using the information that they said they didn't know about. So, for example, if they want to put an envelope into a slot, and the slot might be vertical or horizontal, more than would be expected by chance, they will be able to put the envelope into the slot and say, I don't know if it's horizontal or vertical. And you say, just guess, and they do it, and they get it right. More often than chance. Not always, but of course I don't do it always. More often than chance. So it looks like they're controlling their action, putting the envelope in the slot without consciousness of that. But why? Because they have some access to the information, but at an unconscious level. Same thing with habits, such as driving home on a very familiar route. We'll talk about that later. But my favorite here is musical performance. When somebody practices and practices and practices a musical piece, they can then play it without having to think about which notes they're playing or where they're placing their fingers, even though they are placing their fingers and playing those particular notes. And the same in sports performance. I'm a golfer, and I don't think about every aspect of what I'm doing when I take my golf swing, or I would be not a very good golfer. Speed is another thing. When subliminal primes are achieved with, I don't know, 17 in one of Christina's cases, 30 milliseconds in one of our cases, you can get subliminal primes, and they do affect action. So you must be processing the information at some level, but the report is, I didn't see anything. Okay, and so that can presumably happen when you glance quickly to the side as well. And masking, Marty Waldorf and Liad Mudrik have taught me an awful lot about different kinds of masking. But in certain types of masking, you can actually show that the person's attention was drawn to the object, which is either to the left or the right, and they actually react differentially to what the content of the thing that's masked is, but they say, I didn't see anything. So it looks like they don't have consciousness of it, at least according to the kind of consciousness that Levy is talking about. Remember the quotation before about needing to report it. Okay. How does any of this happen? It's kind of mysterious if you think about it. You know, how can this information affect our actions without us being conscious? One answer, and I'm not sure it's the right one. I'd be interested in hearing what other people think about it. But one possible answer is that we can process information locally, but not globally. And if it's not global, we don't process it consciously, we process it unconsciously according to global workspace theory that I mentioned before. Not according to recurrent processing theory, but at least according to the global workspace theory, you can explain why people's actions can be affected by information that's not conscious to them, because they're only processing it locally. So just to give you a really rough, crude idea of what you mean by locally, it might affect their actions. Let's take the blindsight case. It might affect their actions, whether they put the envelope vertically or horizontally, without affecting their speech acts. It's not available to them reporting it, and they can't reason about it either. And so it's not just speech, it's other types of actions they're not able to do, but they can process the information well enough locally to be able to move their hand vertically or horizontally in appropriate ways. And of course, with a much higher rate of accuracy in the music case than in the blindsight case. I'm not sure whether that's the right theory, but that's at least one plausible story about how we might be able to process information unconsciously, okay? The question then is, okay, if we can do it, are we responsible when we process information without becoming conscious of it? Namely, are agents responsible when they have access to relevant information and do process it, but still do not become conscious of it? Okay, so they access it, they process it, but they lack consciousness. So in our example of the driver running over the tiny kitten, imagine that the driver notices a tail coming out behind one of the rear tires, and they process that information about the kitten, but not long enough or not well enough to ever become conscious of it or aware that the kitten is there. So they only process it locally. They could have become conscious of it by looking longer and focusing on it, but they weren't negligent. If they had no reason to believe that the kitten was there, and they were in a hurry, it was important for them to leave as quickly as possible. So at least in some cases, you're going to be able to say it's not true that they should have become conscious. It's not true that they were negligent, okay? Because they were justified in not paying attention in that circumstance, even though, unfortunately, it turned out it would have been better if they had. Okay, so there's our case. Now, is this driver responsible? Boy, I think that's a tough question. I'm really kind of torn in certain ways when I think about it. So we had to explore it. And there are two ways to approach it. One is surveys of public opinion, and another is philosophical theories. And I'm going to do show you some survey results first, and then turn to the philosophical theories. We didn't use the kitten example for various reasons. We wanted something a little more neutral and less upsetting. This is actually probably a non-moral case, but we wanted it still involves responsibility. So our case was soccer. And I'm going to read you the whole scenario so that you know what our subjects read. I won't do this with the other scenarios later, but as an example, the United women's soccer team is competing in the final playoffs against the Legion women's soccer team. Both teams consider it very important to win. To prepare, both teams watched hours of film to learn about the opposing players. Coincidentally, both teams discover that the other team's goalie usually leans slightly in the direction opposite to the direction in which they plan to jump. For example, the goalie will often lean slightly to the left before jumping to the right, where left and right are always described from the perspective of the kicker. After a closely fought game, including extra time, the score is still tied at 0-0. To break the tie, both teams will have to compete in a penalty kick shootout. Penalty kick is when a player takes a single shot on the goal while it's defended by only the opposing team's goalkeeper. In this league, each team will shoot 5 penalty kicks, and whichever team scores the most penalty kicks out of the 5 attempts will win the game. Both the United and Legion soccer teams select their 5 best shooters to take 1 penalty kick each. These players are so skilled that they always kick the ball into the goal unless the goalie blocks the kick, and the goalie always blocks the kick if she jumps in the direction in which the player kicked the ball. And of course, the goalie does not block the kick if she jumps in the wrong direction. Okay. Now, so our scenarios, we tried to make them long like that in order to be, try to fill in as many of the relevant details as we could. I won't go through all the other scenarios completely as I did for this one. Okay. What were the measures? Well, we changed it so that sometimes the goalie doesn't lean. So there's no information for the kicker to pick up on. Sometimes the goalie leans, but the kicker doesn't notice it, doesn't pay any attention to it, and doesn't notice that the goalie is leaning one way or the other. Sometimes, well, the kicker does notice it, but only in an unconscious way, and processes the information, pays attention, but has no consciousness. Sometimes the kicker becomes conscious, notices the goalie leaning, and is conscious of that lean. And in those 4 conditions, we had sometimes they actually kicked it the right way, and the goalie and the kicker scored, and sometimes they kicked it the wrong way and the goalie missed. And then we had another condition, misinformation, where the kicker is fully conscious of the lean, but the goalie actually, instead of leaning, when they lean to the left, instead of jumping to the right, which they usually do, they actually jump to the left and block the goal if the person kicks it that way. So we had 10 conditions. Not all of these are as important for our purposes as the others. And we asked several questions on a scale from 0 to 100. How responsible was the kicker? And does the kicker deserve credit or blame? We wanted to see whether there were differences between those different questions. Here are the results. One thing to notice is that for both score and miss, when the question was responsibility, the answers are well above the midpoint, where 0 was no responsibility, 100 was complete responsibility. Our subjects had no problems ascribing responsibility, even in the no consciousness case, and significant responsibility. The other thing worth noticing is that the presence of consciousness, adding consciousness to attention. Notice that column 3 is attention without consciousness, and column 4 is attention plus consciousness. So there you're adding consciousness, and that does increase the degree of responsibility, or the average score about the degree of responsibility in the case of scoring, but not in the case of missing. So consciousness seems to increase responsibility in the positive case, but not in the negative. And that holds also when we switch to the questions about credit and blame. It holds across those two. So most people ascribe responsibility without consciousness, but attention without consciousness didn't make any difference, because notice that the line from the second to the third column is not significant. It's flat, okay? But consciousness is related to more responsibility and credit. So positive responsibility for a positive outcome, but it's not related to more responsibility for a negative outcome, such as blame for missing a goal, okay? Now, we puzzled a little bit about why that would be. And again, these are speculations, but one possibility is simply that blaming somebody for the miss is going to kind of cause dissension in the team and hurt their feelings, so it causes some kind of harm. But giving them credit for a score, you know, that doesn't cost anybody anything. Why not be a little more liberal in that? Another possibility is that maybe consciousness affected in the positive case, but not the negative case, because the kicker in the positive case was responding to reasons. They did respond to the goalie's lean in the appropriate way, but when they missed, they might have picked up on that information, but they went the wrong way. And so it might be something about reasons responsiveness that explains this pattern of results. But in any case, that we had a problem with this scenario, the kicker might be blamed for missing when they're not conscious of the lean, because the films that the kicker saw warned the kicker that they ought to look for the lean of the goalie. So the kicker should become conscious, and then they're negligent when they don't. That might be what the participants were thinking. I wasn't thinking that when these scenarios were constructed, but maybe that's what they were thinking. So consciousness still might affect blame if the agent was not warned. So to check that out, we changed to a truck scenario. Here a truck driver is driving a truck that's 13 feet. The scenario is much longer, but these are the basic ideas. During an official training, the truck driver is told that the height of their truck is 13 feet, and every bridge in the general area where they're going to be driving has a clearance of 14 feet. But unfortunately, that's not right. A few bridges on the route are less than 14 feet high, but they're supposed to be by law, and they usually are, marked with a sign that says how high they are. And sometimes the sign in our scenarios said 13 feet 6 inches, and sometimes they said 12 feet 6 inches. Okay, and the sign was visible to the driver. Conditions, very much like last time. Sometimes the sign was misinformation. Sometimes the sign was correct information. It was an accurate sign. And we had the no information, information, but not attention and not consciousness. That's what I mean by I tilde A tilde C is information, but not attention and not consciousness. And then we had condition with information, attention, but not consciousness. And oops, that should be a C there, not a not C. Sorry, typo on the slide. So consciousness as well as attention. How responsible was we asked them these questions. How responsible was the driver for passing safely? How much credit and blame like before? And we got very similar results, right? You got a significant increase in the level of responsibility in the positive case, but not in the negative case. And same for credit and blame. Okay, so the conclusion is like before, just like in study 1, participants ascribed responsibility without consciousness. Attention without consciousness had no effect. So unconscious information processing had no effect. But consciousness is related to responsibility for good, but not for bad outcomes. So the effects that we found in study 1 were not due to the agent being warned, because the agent was not warned in study 2. A couple more problems though. Our participants might have assumed that the driver should have looked for a sign, even though they were told they didn't have to. So they might have thought the driver was negligent. And then consciousness still might affect blame and responsibility when the agent's not negligent, when they were justified in not paying such close attention. Our participants also might not have understood unconscious processing, and they might not have thought of the case as moral. We were thinking of it as moral because it's going to create a lot of problems for a lot of people if the truck hits the bridge. I happen to know that because this scenario was based on a bridge close to my own house that trucks kept getting running into, and believe me, it inconvenienced a lot of people. So we switched to a third study, and this third study, we actually explained what we meant by unconscious information processing. We said, sometimes people are not aware of what they're doing. For example, when driving home on a very familiar route, a driver may be preoccupied with their thoughts and become unaware of their surroundings. You can probably think of other examples when you have experienced something similar in which something is being done on autopilot or without conscious awareness. That's just a selection. It was a long explanation. And then we asked them, how well do you understand that notion, and how realistic do you think it is that somebody can pay attention to something and process information about it without becoming conscious of it? So we used a coat scenario in this case. We wanted to vary our scenarios to see if it held in different cases. This one, it was a very cold night. Diners at a restaurant leave their warm and expensive coats on a rack by the entrance. And one diner hangs their coat on the end of the rack. Their coat's very common in color and style, so it's easily confused with other coats. In the middle of the meal, the diner gets a call about a serious family emergency. And as they rush out, they quickly grab the coat on the end of the rack where they had placed their coat. And the inside of the coat that they grab is marked with initials different from the diner's own initials. The diner kind of notices that to the side in the attention without consciousness condition. They pay some attention to the initials for a moment, but never become conscious. They process the information only unconsciously, as though on autopilot, to refer back to the explanation we gave. But unfortunately, they got the wrong coat, which belongs to a different customer. We didn't have a positive case where they got the right coat in this, because we really wanted to see whether we could get consciousness to affect the negative case. When the other customer leaves the restaurant, they can't find their coat and they're very cold on the way home. So there's some damage to the other person by this mistake. Okay, so what measures do we use? Like before, we have no information, information without attention or consciousness, information and attention without consciousness, and information, attention, and consciousness all together. So this time we asked them, we gave them sentences and asked, do you agree or disagree, from -100 to 100. We asked them about responsibility and blame, but we also asked, did the person become conscious? You know, as an attention check or a comprehension check. Could they have become conscious? Should they have become conscious? And here again, we got well above, most people were willing to ascribe responsibility, even in the no consciousness case, and we got effects on response. But this time we got effects of consciousness. So you notice that the third column is lower than the fourth column. That means that when you take something that's information and attention, but not conscious, there's less responsibility than it's information and attention and also consciousness. So adding consciousness increases the level of responsibility. We also did a mediation analysis because we wanted to know whether this effect can be explained by their judgments about whether the person should become conscious. This is a very complicated diagram and I'm running low on time, so I'm going to just say what we found is that should does indeed partially but strongly mediate the relationship between the condition and responsibility. So it looks like it should, does. Could actually also mediates, but less strongly. And so it looks like the best explanation of why they're holding this person responsible is they should have become conscious. So like studies 1 and 2, they ascribed responsibility without consciousness. The presence of information increased their judgments. When the information was present, processing without consciousness did not. But unlike them, in this new study, we found that consciousness did increase judgments of responsibility and blame for bad outcomes, in this case, losing the coat. Now, why? Maybe because the diner was justified in rushing. We now got this effect. So it looks like the diner was neither negligent nor should have become conscious, because we actually made it clear that it was a serious problem that they had to rush home as quickly as possible, and so on. But still, the answers to should and could partially mediate and explain this relationship. So should seems to be playing a role, even if we succeeded in taking it out of the mix through the scenario. Okay. So does the public agree with these philosophical theories? Well, not with Levy's consciousness thesis, because they ascribe responsibility in the agents who are not conscious. It might be the conscious effect of the level of responsibility, but it's not necessary for any responsibility at all. Similarly, the public doesn't seem to agree with Schur's disjunctive thesis, because they ascribe responsibility in agents who are both unconscious and also justified in not paying close attention, especially, say, scenario 3. But still, Schur's disjunctive thesis includes a reference to the standards being violated. So it would be interesting to him that should affects the degree of responsibility getting ascribed. So it looks like the factors that they're looking at, in Levy's case, consciousness, in Schur's case, whether you should become conscious, do affect the level of responsibility, even if they're not necessary for any responsibility at all. So what? Whatever lay people think, is it philosophically defensible to ascribe responsibility without consciousness and without negligence? Well, you could try to answer this just, intuitively, but I don't know why you should trust your intuitions in cases like these, because that's not the kind of case that our intuitions were developed in order to handle. So I think it's better to apply theories. And I'm going to focus on the control theory, at least in the version where reason's responsiveness is indicative of control, and the deep self theory very quickly. Levy focuses on those as well. He says, only when we are conscious of the facts that give our actions their moral significance are those actions expressive of our identities as practical agents. So he's referring to deep self theories. And do we possess the kind of control that is plausibly required for moral responsibility? That control is reason's responsiveness, according to that theory at least. So that's why I picked these two theories. So first, reason's responsiveness. Well, according to this theory, it's fairly well known, so I'm just going to outline it here. An agent is responsive to reasons regarding a kind of act if and only if it's both receptive to reasons and also reactive to reasons for and against that kind of act. And an agent's receptive to reasons for and against the act if they usually recognize reasons to perform the act and not to perform. I put recognize in caps because that seems to suggest consciousness. And they're reactive to reasons if and only if they usually act according to the reasons that they recognize. Again, seems like it might imply consciousness. Okay. Similarly for the deep self theory. Here's again just a crude summary. An agent's morally responsible for an action if and only if it expresses her deep self. An act expresses your deep self if and only if the act is motivated by one of one's cares. And cares are sources of intrinsic motivation. You have to be motivated to continue caring. And you care only if the person forms normatively favorable judgments about it. Forms suggest you might have to be conscious, and the person feels positively valenced emotions about it. So it sounds like feels might be conscious too. So it looks like for the reasons responsible for both theories, you have to be conscious, okay, of the information that's morally relevant. But I don't see why an agent has to be conscious of a reason in order to recognize it. Because the reason can be processed unconsciously and can still affect actions, as I argued, at least if the information spreads locally, such as to the action, but not the report, but not widely enough to count as conscious in the global workspace theory. So it seems to me the reasons responsiveness theory does not require consciousness. Force of the theory. Same with deep self. It says you have to feel it and form it, but does that require consciousness? Must the deep self include only conscious cares, or could it also include unconscious cares? Seems to me an agent can be affected by and hence express what they care about, even if they're not conscious of that thing or of what they care about. Okay, they're affected, then the fact that they do that action expresses it. So it seems to me both theories could be reformulated so as not to require consciousness. At present, they seem to suggest that consciousness is necessary, but I don't see why we don't just change that aspect of the theory and form a modified theory that doesn't require it. So my overall conclusions are that the consciousness thesis and the disjunctive thesis of Levy and Scher, they both conflict with public opinion. It doesn't show they're wrong, but it's a strike against them. And they're not necessary on the leading theories of responsibility, just taking the deep self and reasons responsiveness as the leading theories. They might be necessary the way those theories are formulated now, but that's just a feature of the way they happen to be formulated. It's not essential to the theories themselves. So I reject both of these theses, Levy and Scher, and conclude that responsibility does not require consciousness, even when the agents are not negligent. Okay. I just want to end with one quick mention that this has interesting implications, I think, because I've been concerned recently with artificial intelligence and computers, and it seems to me that future intelligent but unconscious computers still might be morally responsible for causing harm if consciousness is not necessary for moral responsibility. Now, whether that's a defensible implication or not, I'll leave it up for discussion, and I look forward to your questions about these conclusions, as well as about anything else that I've been talking about. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Walter. That was terrific. So I have a bunch of questions myself, but of course, as the host, I'll give the precedence for anyone else questions. Adina.
Great talk, Walter. I
Thanks.
can't see you anymore. Oh, good to see you. There you are. So I have a question about whether you think that these kinds of judgments, like take the soccer case, for instance. First, it seemed to me that even though people are ascribing responsibility in those unconscious states, number one, the agent's a conscious agent, right? So you haven't totally gotten rid of creature consciousness anyway.
Right.
But they don't rate it super high. It's above 50%. And it struck me that this is sort of parallel in structure to some of Fiery Cushman's work that shows that people punish, the judge acts are worthy of punishment in cases even when they're unintentional, if the harms are consequential enough, which you could read in two ways, either that, like we're kind of wrong about our theories of intention and its relationship to responsibility, or that people, the people's judgments about these things are kind of off in systematic ways. And so I guess there's a question about the relationship. Is it just a structural parallel? Is there some more significant relationship between these constructs, the non-intentional harms and these kinds of unconscious cases? And should we just conclude that because the folk judge it this way, that's what morality says, or that the folk are just wrong in some cases?
So I consider intentionality to be separate from consciousness. They're two separate issues. You're absolutely right. There's a structural parallel there. But take, for example, the case of blindsight, when someone puts the envelope through a vertical or horizontal slot accurately without being conscious. Well, it seems to me they did it intentionally, even though they were not conscious of doing it. They might have even thought they were probably going to fail. And other cases, you can get consciousness, without intention, as in a lot of the kinds of cases that Cushman discusses, where the person is conscious of what they're doing, but they didn't do it as part of their plan. That's from the classic doctrine of double effect since the Middle Ages, for example, talks about knowing that you're doing something and being conscious of it without it being intentional or part of your plan. You also get a separation in the kind of Knobe effect cases that people are familiar with, that in the case of the positive effect, it says absolutely the CEO that adopts a certain policy that helps the environment, they didn't intentionally help the environment. That was not part of their intention, but they knew they were helping the environment. So it seems to me that the issue of intentionality is different from the case of consciousness. Although I agree with you, there's a structural parallel there, and I probably ought to refer to it when we write this stuff.
Yeah, I have a question. Does it work? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's simply too complicated for me to think it through, so I ask you. And in psychology, you have this idea of a prepared reflex. So I form the intention to do something if a specific condition is fulfilled. But then I do something else, and accidentally this condition occurs. I want to hunt a white rabbit, or I form the intention to shoot a white rabbit, but then I think today white rabbits won't occur, so I will shoot the deer, but then a white rabbit occurs and I shoot the white rabbit because I have formed the intention in the first place to shoot it, but in the moment when it appears, I don't consciously intend to shoot it because I'm looking for deer, whatever.
Right. So I have to ask a question about the case, because those kinds of cases are never clear to me. When you say, oh, I guess I'm not going to see a white rabbit today, I think I'll hunt for deer instead. Do you actually give up your intention to hunt the white rabbit, or you just have two intentions simultaneously? I mean, after all, you can be in the woods intending to kill a deer and a white rabbit if one comes along, even though you're very skeptical that one will come along. I mean, so you can have both intentions. That's not, they're not incompatible.
From a cognitive perspective, it's a little bit tricky. But I want to make the case that you give up the intention to hunt the white rabbit, but because you have formed the intention in the first place, the white rabbit activates the action to shoot it.
Yeah, so then I would say if you have an intention to hunt the white rabbit, if one shows up, and then one shows up and you shoot it, you did it intentionally. You were not conscious maybe at the time of intending that, but you had, as you said, this reflex such that it appears and then you shoot it. I wouldn't say you shot the white rabbit accidentally. You saw
did,
this
because
white rabbit and pointed your gun at it and pulled the trigger. That sounds intentional to me.
at the moment when I shoot it, I don't have the intention to shoot the white rabbit. I'm not even, maybe not even aware of the white rabbit. This is the idea of the prepared reflex. It's something I intend before, and then only the triggering condition automatically activates it.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think about the case that you're talking about, because it's a matter of me seeing something and then pointing the gun. That sounds to me that I'm intending to shoot the thing that's out there that's triggering.
So maybe the example isn't
not conscious. See, I've got no problem saying it's intentional but not conscious. I don't think intentions have to be conscious.
Maybe
so I'm inclined to say it would be intentional even if it's not conscious.
Maybe my example isn't good. I don't know whether it makes sense to go more into it. So the example is I want to respond to the color of a stimulus. When it's red, I press left. When it's green, I press right. Now I forget about that and respond to another task. So for example, to the shape of the stimulus. So I want to respond to the shape of the stimulus now, but accidentally the shape has a color. And then the color influences my behavior, even though I'm at that moment do not respond to the color of the stimulus. It's a case of your unconscious influence that you describe. So maybe
so notice that case is very different from the deer case, because in that case you're intending to respond to the shape and you're also intending not to respond to the color. Whereas in the hunting the deer case, you had an intention to shoot deer, but you didn't form an intention not to shoot rabbits. And so in that case, I would say, yes, it's unintentional because you formed an intention not to react to the color green, but you did react to the color green. So it was unintentional when you did so. Whereas in the hunting case, you didn't form an intention not to shoot white rabbits.
So then you are not responsible.
So I'm just talking about intentionality. I didn't say anything about responsibility. In the hunting case, you did intentionally shoot the white rabbit, even if it was unconscious. But in the blue-green, in the color versus shape case, it was unintentional because it was contrary to your intention, where your intention was an intention not to respond to the color.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Marcel, can you pass the mic for Santiago, please?
Hey, Walter. Thank you.
Hi.
So I want to share two worries that I have, and they're genuine worries. They're not criticisms. I want to know how you think about this. It seems to me that the three studies, the cases, the first two are slightly different from the third. In the first two cases, the soccer case, the driver case, it's not clear to me that we're talking about moral responsibility.
Right.
But there's no moral transgression. So I wonder if that, is something that it's making a little bit of a noise here. So we might have some sort of like professional responsibility, and the criteria for attributing professional responsibility might not be the same as moral responsibility. Second worry. I didn't have enough time to look at all the graphs, but I think Dina also noted that the ascriptions of blame were not very high. And this is a worry that I have with some of the stuff that we've been doing, is how much of this, results that we're getting are explained by the fact that our subjects are not using, in general, scales, the extremes of the scales. So we do have, conceptual space, as it were, when we design the scales, but it's not the case. And I just see them, our subjects tend not to use the bottoms because they need to move them somewhere and they don't want to move it all the way down. So how much of this might be due to, the way subjects are thinking about the scales that we're providing them with? Those are the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. I'm going to share screen to answer the second one first. Can you see that now?
Yep.
Just study 2. That looks pretty high to me on blame. I mean, it's 80 and above on a scale of 0 to 100. And that includes conditions where there's no consciousness. The case where there's information that's not attended to and information that's attended to, but you never become conscious of it. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I hope so.
Yeah.
And these are both above 80.
And there is a slight up when attention and consciousness appear. Yeah. You see it.
You mean from the 3rd to the 4th? That's actually not significant, though.
Yeah, it's not significant.
Yeah.
A difference.
But in any case, in answer to your second question, Santiago, it's, in some of our results, we got, pretty high levels of blame there. So I don't know about them not. Look at the all the people who are at the very max up here. They're using the end of the scale. All those people up here are using the end of the scale, and all these people down here, when there's no information, are
good. I see it. Maybe I misremember one of the results, but as I said, they were very quick for me to see all of them.
It was not so much. It was not so much true here. This was the soccer case, but notice in the credit they're using the end of the scale. In the soccer case, sorry, I've got to run through my slides here, but there we go. But for the truck, they're using the end of the scale both for responsibility and also for blame. And let me just check the third one. I haven't thought about this issue in the third one. Yeah, they're not as high in this one, right? But it doesn't look like our participants had any trouble using the end of the scale and ascribing high levels of blame. The first worry that you had was about moral versus non-moral, and I completely agree. I actually think of the second case as moral, but they don't seem to think of it that way. So maybe it's just because this bridge is next to my house and I was inconvenienced too many times. I kept going like, what an idiot, don't you care about other people and blocking the traffic? But they're not thinking of it that way. So that's one reason we switched in study 3 to something that was more, we thought, clearly moral. But look, we ought to try different scenarios because it's not clear whether when something is even more moral and more serious, we might get different results. So I welcome your point about moral versus non-moral. I'm interested in a notion of responsibility that's not necessarily responsibility for moral wrongdoing. I think there's a very interesting notion of responsibility when you say, whose fault is it that we lost the game? That the team lost the game. That strikes me as something worth looking at and comparing to responsibility for moral wrongdoing to seeing whether it follows the same patterns or not. Thank you for your questions.
Peter.
Hi, Walter. Peter here. Yeah, I'd like to continue the line of questioning that Marcel started with prepared, what did you call it? Automaticities or reflexes, right? So it seems to me that you can end up with an identical prepared reflex or automaticity for different reasons. So for example, let's take the case of even more, white rabbits, let's say friendly fire. I commit an act of friendly fire because I have an automaticity for being trigger happy. And I can get there in different ways. I can intend to play video games that are very violent and wire up that automaticity, or I could be in the military and be forced to play such video games and wire up the same automaticity, and both of those were wired up consciously, or I can put that automaticity there in an unconscious way. I can give you a post-hypnotic suggestion, such that if you're in the situation, you'll fire. Or I can do semantic priming. I have you read a story that has the words in it, when in doubt, shoot, right? But in the moment, the automaticity is identical and the friendly fire act is identical. Are there different kinds of moral blameworthiness in these 4 cases because of the different sources of the automaticity?
I mean, I think that's going to be a controversial question and people aren't going to agree about it. But that's where the distinction between direct and indirect responsibility becomes very relevant. If you voluntarily got yourself into the situation, so then you're going to be responsible even when you're in the situation. Remember the example of somebody who drives drunk. They got themselves into the situation where they, lost control of the car or went to sleep or whatever. Or I know the example I gave was the person who had the epileptic seizure. They got into the car knowing there was a risk, and then once it's automatic later. So you can be responsible for what you do, when it's automatic, because you at an earlier point did something that was not automatic to create that automatic impulse in yourself. But that's indirect responsibility. That's not direct responsibility. Does that make sense? I'm not sure whether it answered your question, because you go, is the person responsible? And then the answer is not if you're talking only about direct responsibility, but yes, if you're talking about either direct or indirect responsibility. In some of your cases, you mentioned the person would be indirectly responsible. In other cases, not, because it wasn't their fault, like when they were hypnotized against their will.
Right. Next in line is Jonathan Phillips. I don't know if he just left the room, but he was waiting. Jonathan, are you there? So I'll go for Thomas. Thomas, please feel free to jump in the debate.
Hey, Walter.
Hey,
It's good seeing you as always.
good to see you. Yeah.
This is a follow-up, I guess, to Santiago's. I had some of the same questions. And one reason, there were 2 different observations. One, so you say you want to have this sort of broader notion of responsibility, which I agree is important. But then if you package this in terms of being a response to like Scher and Levy, who are interested in the sort of moral responsibility stuff, then the questions are raised about, well, why didn't you use moral, the moral cases, they're not being sort of overtly moral, is more sort of, I guess, problematic. But what I think you'll find, if you run like sort of over the top moral cases that are like very morally valenced and bad, is that contrary to what Scher and Levy say, you'll find what you want, which is their desire to blame is going to be so high, the worse you make those cases, that they're just not going to care about the consciousness condition they might care for at some lower threshold. So it might just be that you get, like, that would be my prediction actually, is if you use like sort of really awful cases, they just won't care as much about consciousness, right? So the easiest way to show that what people think is largely what you think is to make the valence sort of more severe, or that's what I think will happen anyway.
Yeah. My co-author Christina just put right in the chat, and I agree. I think if we make them more severe, then people are going to want to get that sucker who just killed somebody. And the problem, I mean, one reason we did not use those scenarios is we figured that results of that sort would be dismissed for that very reason. Right? And so when we use the more kind of normal, like just stole a coat, then you can't say these people are overcome with anger and that's why they're messing up their judgments and not making any sense. So we wanted to go for the more kind of moderate cases instead of the extreme cases, because I think you're right. We would get bigger effects on the extreme cases, but it'd be easier for Scher and Levy to dismiss them.
Yeah.
Is it Jonathan back or? Okay, so I have a question myself. Actually, I have 2. First of all, in the cases Marcel just cited, like, I don't know, Stroop test, flanker test, what we what you have is, I mean, in terms of brain processing, it's a lot of anterior cingulate processing, probably suggesting conflict monitoring. I mean, in moral dilemmas, we've seen the same brain areas being activated. My question is, though, considering this case, is a person that takes one course of action, the severe conflict will be less responsible than a person that's absolutely resolute to do the harm. That's my first question. The second question is based on a real case, high courts, Supreme Court case in Canada, to be a high court, a high profile of a murder case that went to the Supreme Court in Canada. The guy actually already was addicted in gambling, but he was a sleepwalker at the same time. He dresses, he opens his car, apparently just in the condition of sleepwalking. He drives, I don't know what, 35 miles, 20 minutes drive. He enters someone's house, kill the person, come back, and when he is about to come back home, he sees all the blood. He kind of gets some consciousness, some memory of he has just done, and he goes to a police station to declare himself guilty. But he was acquitted because by the doctor's diagnosis, he was a sleepwalker, and the cameras that were used during the trial for the analysis of those specialists in sleepwalking, he was absolutely in the condition of a severe sleepwalking, and he was acquitted on this basis. So my question is, independent of what people believe in terms of responsibility, even if the lay people believe that without consciousness, we are responsible, I mean, can science show otherwise? And maybe the opinion even of the majority will not be as important as in those kinds of experiments that we just measuring beliefs. Those are my two questions.
So the second question is about the relationship with science. And no, I do not think science can show that somebody is or is not responsible. Responsibility is a normative notion about when certain types of sanctions or reactions are justified or not justified, fair or unfair, moral or immoral. That's not the kind of thing science can establish. So I don't think that that science can answer these questions alone. I think science and philosophy have to work together. So that's my answer to that question. And then the case you mentioned was the case of Parks that I talked about. Yeah, that's the case where he was sleepwalking and did the harm. What was the first question, though? I think I've forgotten the first question.
The first question was about the fact that in the tests Marcel cited, you have a lot of conflict monitoring between
right.
two types of information processing. What was asking was if the case of people that are under severe conflict monitoring and people that are more resolute to do the harm, if you see a level at least of more or less moral responsibility in their actions.
Right. So here I would appeal to this distinction between attributability and accountability. Suppose that somebody has, has to kill, one little girl in order to save his daughter. And he feels extreme conflict about that because he really does not want to kill anybody. Then it seems to me you might say, look, under the circumstances, or don't make it killing, that's too strong, but has to knock over one little girl in order to save his daughter. And he feels a conflict about it, and the little girl gets hurt. Well, I would say it's not that he's a bad person, so it's not attributable to him, but he is still accountable. If that little girl has some type of medical bills from a broken leg or something, I think he ought to pay the bills. when he knocked her over and she broke her leg, but that was his only way of saving his own daughter. But notice that if he didn't feel any conflict at all, he just said, get out of the way, and ran to his daughter without the least concern about the other little girl. Then I would say, in addition to being accountable, it's also attributable. The fact that he does not feel any conflict in those circumstances shows that he's a bad person, or that at least he has some kind of bad character trait, such as lack of concern for other people. So I would say that this distinction between attributability and accountability might help here, because when there is a conflict, you can be accountable, but that doesn't make it attributable. Whereas in the case of intense, when there's no conflict, it might be both accountable and also attributable. Or at least, that's my inclination. I don't know if that rings true to you or not.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We have one last minute, so we're gonna have a very short question from Renato. And I ask you also, Walter, to be brief, and then we go for the coffee break. Please, Renato.
Okay, thank you, Walter, for your talk. It's not even a question, it's just an observation. If you try to replicate these cases, especially here in Brazil, the penalty case would fall into the observation Nadelhofer made. Those are some extreme cases. Me and Gabriel is laughing here. I bet he still knows the name of the guy that lost a penalty kick in a final for his team. I know, and I still blame that guy. And I'm sure he knows the name of the guy that made the penalty kick, and he still praises him a lot. So it would be a quick question. How much do you think there is a minimal common denominator in all these things, and how much do you think is cultural? This is a question that has been popping up for the entire conference. How much these kinds of attribution are culturally dependent and how much not?
Well, I mean, you'd have to do a cross-cultural study to answer that question. Far be it from me to just guess, not knowing about soccer culture in Brazil or football culture in Brazil. So I think there are going to be differences. Many times when I have tried to do a cross-cultural study, they've been less than I expected. But we also have some independent results with Paulo Boggio in Sao Paulo, showing that there is a big difference between the UK and the US on the one hand, and Brazilians on the other hand, in their moral judgments of refugees. So yeah, there are cultural differences. How big they are, hey, that's an empirical question, subject to study. And I'd love to do studies with anybody who wants to try this out in Brazil and see whether the results replicate there.
Okay, thanks a lot, Walter. That was terrific. A big round of applause for Mr. Walter Sinnott-Armstrong.